Greetings and welcome, travelers. Please take a moment to give that like button some love. Maybe share the video with a friend. If you'd like to hear more like it, please subscribe. Now, on with the story. The Zhu Chang Saga by user Hume Reddit. Set within the Jenkinsverse by Hambone. Chapter 1. Monkeys Reaches Stars. Part 1. Zhu, what can I? Zhu giggled as the little alien kid ran over, chanting the familiar demand. It was morning, or, well, as close to morning as she could guess. She was sure her sleep patterns had shifted over the last month, and there was no day or night cycle here. But she had a routine, and her roommates had figured it out. Every morning she would stretch and practice her forms, and the aliens, looking for all the world like human-sized bipedal raccoons, liked to watch her do it for some reason. The little ones were vocal in their admiration, and they were so astonishingly adorable that Zhu couldn't refuse them. They couldn't pronounce her name properly, but that just made it cuter. She didn't know what they were saying, but she figured out that wo can I was their way of asking for her to practice. The adults just liked having their children distracted from their horrible circumstances. Zhu stood, having finished washing her face in the running sink of water that occupied a single corner of the large gray room. Her clothing, a simple t-shirt and leggings, were getting grimy and smelly, and her long hair hung limply. 3 weeks locked in this large gray room without a shower was wearing her down. After the first week, she'd finally surrendered to necessity and given herself the most miserable and cold sponge bath ever, using one of her leg warmers as a cloth and trying to ignore the curious gazes of the raccoons as she removed her clothing. They may have been aliens, but that didn't mean she wasn't blushing furiously the entire time. Still, it had made her feel better. She probably wouldn't need a wash so much if she didn't exercise, but being a prisoner didn't mean she wanted to lose her hard-earned muscle tone. It was hard enough to work up a proper sweat in the lighter gravity of wherever she was. She tossed her impromptu washcloth over by her winter coat, which was folded up on the hard slate-gray floor where it had been acting as a pillow since her arrival. She looked over at little Myun and beckoned. The little alien chittered, which she had guessed was their version of a happy laughter. The lights of the high ceiling shone brightly upon them as she walked over to an open area of the room and sank into the deep mabu, or horse stance. Myun imitated her, though with far less success. The aliens had long bodies and short, stubby legs, so they had a harder time balancing. She slipped into the form, letting her arms and legs move with the confidence of endless repetition. Her pace was slow. When she'd first started these exercises shortly after her capture, she hadn't wanted to alarm the aliens she was imprisoned with. When some of the little ones had begun imitating her, she hadn't wanted to outpace or embarrass them. So she moved at a rate that was closer to a Taiji meditation instead of the violent sharpness of Jingyi or the swirling movements of Bagua. Beside her, Myun tipped over, but chittered in good humor. Ima smiled as Myun flopped over again in her attempts to imitate their fellow alien prisoner. The 3 other children watched in fascination as the human female stretched and contorted and balanced her body in ways that were astonishing. Yet the movements were incredibly graceful, beautiful in their elegance. They didn't know why she danced for them, but the cubs loved it, and it was a welcome distraction, even for the adults. It helped them forget that they were all lab animals, trapped in a cage. They'd been snatched by mercenaries on a simple trip between their homeworld Gao and the second colony, Gorai, a settler ship full of females and children. The males had spent their lives bravely resisting the invaders, but there had simply been too many of the huge 4-armed locale, armed with pulse rifles that were several centuries more advanced than their own. Her species was a clever one. They had progressed from flight to their first space station in less than 200 stellar rotations of their homeworld, which was apparently a new galactic record. But there were still latecomers on the scene. The more helpful of the other species of the galaxy had warned them that it was an unfriendly place, especially for those species that had yet to join the Galactic Council properly. The Gauians were cautious by nature. The offer to join the Council and the vague hints of consequences if they didn't had sounded a little too much like bullying, so they wanted to carefully examine the fine print. They'd been right to be concerned. Some of the trade regulations weren't acceptable, and some requirements impinged on their sovereignty. The sticking points had been worked through, however, and there was hope that they'd be a full proper member of the interstellar community in less than 10 stellar rotations. It really wasn't a surprise that some races wished to victimize the Gowans before they could join the club. Their captain and crew eliminated, the females and children had been herded into cages on the mercenary ship. Their own vessel, and the evidence, had been destroyed with a core overload. Trapped in the cages, they'd been taken to this installation on an unoccupied world, shoved into this single large room with its embarrassing amenities, and left to await their fate. Every day, someone different would be taken. The ones who returned spoke of experiments. It was no shock to learn that their captors were Corti, the vile scientists of the galaxy. Blood was drawn, biopsies taken, fur shaved. One of the young females had returned missing an eye. Another had her arm taken below the elbow. Their bodies could be repaired, if they managed to get home, but their spirits would remember. And they were the lucky ones. 2 of their number never returned at all. It made Ima's whiskers quiver with rage. On Gao, females were sacred, second only to the cubs. The males had many clans, but the females only one. Every female was clan with every other member, and woe be to those who harmed the clan. The males would compete in wars their instincts demanded, but they always kept it amongst themselves. A male who harmed a female would find it impossible to mate. If a male harmed a cub, he would be torn apart by every female in reach, and by every male who ever hoped to have a cub of his own. So far, the Corti and their thuggish henchmen had yet to try to take one of the cubs, but Ima knew it was only a matter of time. It shamed her to think it, but she hoped that they took Shu first. She liked the strange alien, but the fact remained that she wasn't Gowin, and wasn't clan, although Ima was reasonably certain she was female. The breasts might have been large and oddly placed, but they were breasts, even hidden under the clothing. She'd been dumped into their holding cell straight from a holding cage, just as they had been, mere hours after their arrival. She'd been obviously terrified of them, just as they'd been of her. She cowered in the corner for nearly a day, and they hadn't approached. She obviously didn't have a translator, and didn't understand a word they spoke, nor did her strange words mean anything to them. Ima noticed that she spoke at least 2 languages, as the harsh barking sounds and the sing-song words that sounded so similar to Gowan couldn't possibly be the same tongue. Eventually, it had been Ima herself who had broken the tension, offering the furless humanoid a nutrient sphere, the semi-solid gray suspension of basic proteins, carbohydrates, and minerals that was edible to all species and palatable to none. She had to pantomime their purpose, finally eating one in front of her and leaving another on the floor and backing away. Shu had timidly picked it up, and finally, 2 days of hunger had pushed her into taking a tiny bite. Ima had chittered in laughter. Disgust transcended language. But the alien female had finished the sphere, and then astonished them all by standing to move over to the dispenser embedded into the wall to consume 4 more. After that, they'd haltedly exchanged names in the clumsy way of first contact everywhere. Ima had pointed to herself and said, "Ima." Then she'd pointed around to the others. "Gowian." The alien pointed at Ima with a long, slender finger from one hairless hand, so much like a Corti's but with fewer digits. "Ima." Ima bounced her head in an affirmation. "Gowian." Encouraged, she gestured again. Ima pointed at a nearby female. "Ujali." Then at the little cub who was currently peeking out from behind her. "Myun." One by one, she was introduced to each of the members of the ill-fated voyage. When she was done, she looked at the alien expectantly. The alien realized after a moment, then pointed at herself. "Shu," she said. "Human." The human was friendly enough once the ice was broken. Understandably nervous, and after a while, Ima realized it wasn't just because of the circumstances. In fact, Shu seemed to barely have a grasp on their predicament. After some clumsy sign language communication, Ima realized that their lone visitor was from an uncontacted species. She felt even more sympathy for the lost humanoid. The Council considered species without FTL ability as barely sapient, and certainly wouldn't expend any effort in returning her home. She had no way to tell Shu this, and wasn't sure if it would help her at all, even if she could. She watched with them as every day the huge guards would open the door, pick one of the galleons, and drag them off for study and experimentation. She saw how resistance was met with pain sticks, the merest touch enough to leave an adult female twitching in agony on the floor. The body language of another species was always hard to decipher, but I'm most confident the strangely mobile and expressive face of Zhu showed horror each time. The fright and despair was broken only by the boredom. Their cage was a large square room with only the nutrient dispenser, the water fountain, and a single omni-species toilet with only a single thin wall for privacy. There was no stimulation, and the cubs were understandably restless within a day. The adults had no desire to burden the children with their own lack of hope, but they also had nothing to distract them with. Zhu apparently also experienced boredom. Ima had no idea whether their days were equivalent to the humans or what kind of day-night schedule they had, but shortly after waking from her sleep cycle on the fourth day, the alien female had begun stretching her body in an astonishingly limber display, and once she judged herself sufficiently pliable, she'd begun to dance. A strange dance for certain, but beautiful. She moved in a circle, her movements as smooth as oiled machinery. Her upper limbs would extend like wings or thrust in front of her. She sometimes crouched amazingly low or leaped incredibly high, and when she landed it was with barely a whisper. Ima had thought that the creature was a mammal, possibly a primate, but with such displays she had to wonder whether Zhu was actually avian. The cubs, who had begun to become listless and left with nothing but their fear, had been delighted. Zhu breathed softly as she traced her way through the Bagua Nigung, her hands drawing lines and circles gently in the air. Beside her, Myun imitated her as best as her short limbs allowed, and Zhu couldn't help but smile. She kept her lips shut. She'd read once that humans and other primates were unique in showing teeth as a friendly gesture, and she didn't want to frighten anyone. She never once thought that that kind of information would be anything more than trivia, just as she'd never thought she'd be doing kung fu in outer space with aliens. She didn't even consider herself that much of a student. She took the classes because her mother constantly lamented how Americanized her daughter was. Never mind the fact that they lived in Vancouver and she was technically Chinese-Canadian. Her mother complained constantly about her clothing, her music, even her accent when she spoke Mandarin. She sometimes wondered if her mother considered university to be an expensive dating service. Apparently, instead of working on her degree, she was supposed to be finding a studious young man in the engineering or computer sciences departments with good prospects so she could settle down and marry. The fact that this young man should be Chinese went without saying, and Mother wondered why she got along so much better with Daddy. Zhu had her own plans. She wanted to be an actress. She idolized the likes of Zhang Ji, Gong Li, and Michelle Yeoh. Her mother's complaints that she was becoming too detached from the country of her birth was ridiculous. Zhang Ji was an amazing ambassador of Chinese culture. Too masculine? Had her mother never looked at Gong Li? Daddy, busy as he was supportive, funding her ballet classes and kung fu lessons, along with her university tuition. Zhu worked hard, determined that one day it would be her on a stage, accepting a Golden Horse Award, or perhaps even an Oscar. Her father would be there, and he'd be proud. She hoped she'd see them again, even Mother. It had been on her way home from night ballet classes that she'd been taken. It had been like something out of a movie. A beam of light had shone down on her from the heavens, and her feet had taken leave of the earth. If anyone had heard her shrieks, they hadn't responded. She'd been carried up and straight into a barred metal cage, being stared at by a lone creature that looked absolutely like the aliens from that Roswell video hoax. Except it probably wasn't a hoax, was it? Before she could react, he'd pressed something against the side of her throat, and with a pfft of expelled air, something had been injected under her skin. Then he turned and simply left. Left her in her cage, in the gray, featureless room. She'd screamed and kicked at the bars, but they hadn't cared. She'd cowered when two of the huge four-armed aliens had come in to stare at her. In the back of her mind, she'd understood that the subtle vibrations of the deck and her cage were the hum of an engine that was likely flinging them through space at impossible speeds. A day later, she'd been dumped into this holding room, like a tiger captured on safari, to share a room with 24 human-sized raccoons. At least they'd been friendly, and they were prisoners like her. She didn't know what happened each day when one of them would be dragged off by the behemoths, as she called them, but her imagination supplied a number of awful possibilities, each worse than the last. Possibilities that were confirmed as the raccoons began returning, those that did return, with terrible wounds. Xiu didn't know why she practiced her forms in such a place. Maybe it was because the gravity felt so much lighter. She felt like she wouldn't need wires to reproduce the amazing stunts from the movies she studied. Maybe because she wanted to feel like she still had some power, and martial arts were about inner strength. Maybe she did it because no matter what it was meant for, Kung Fu was beautiful, and this place needed beauty. She'd completed her routine once already and was launching into a second iteration when the lone door to the shared room groaned upward. She halted in her movements as she heard the hisses of fright from the raccoons. Myeon whimpered and hid behind Xiu, wide black eyes peeking round her hip. Two of the behemoths stepped into the room. They were huge, twice as tall as Xiu herself, although she would reluctantly admit that didn't say much, and possessed of 4 arms that were as thick around the biceps as her own waist. Their skin was a pale beige, and their clothing was little more than baggy khaki shorts with equipment and what were likely symbols of rank attached to the belt. They looked like fat old men with oddly angled eyes, huge goiters, and tiny holes where the ears on a human would be located. Each held 2 of the long metal sticks that would cripple any of the raccoons that resisted with the barest touch. They stopped just inside the door, surveying the frightened prisoners. Their tiny, beady eyes turned in Xiu's direction, and one raised an arm, pointing at her with a fat 3-fingered hand. Her heart froze in her chest. What do you want?" she asked, her voice shaking. The behemoth stomped towards her, growling in a low, unintelligible voice. "What do you want? Why did you take me?" The big alien stared down at her shaking form, repeating whatever it said before, but she didn't understand. Finally, it lost its patience, grabbing hold of her shoulder and shoving her to the side. With its last free hand, it reached for Myeon. Xiu heard the barks of the adult raccoons, matching her own shocked inhalation. "What? No, not her!" She reached out and grabbed the alien hand before it could wrap around Myeon's tiny arm. The behemoth had been expecting it. One of its sticks swung down and caught her across the collarbone, and she felt like she'd been tased. She cried out, collapsing on one knee. She heaved in a breath as the behemoth lifted the stick, thinking her finished, as he grabbed again for the alien child. Xiu found the strength to grab his wrist again. She saw his beady little eyes go wide. He swung the taser stick down again, hitting her in the arm. And this time he held it against her. Fire spread up and down her arm as she braced herself and took it. The hand that held his wrist clenched from the shock, and she felt bone crumble inside her grip as it did. His skin tore, and greenish blood leaked out across her fingers. The behemoth roared in pain. What? The adult raccoons had gone berserk as soon as the little one was threatened. They swarmed the other big alien, who swung both of his taser sticks back and forth. The slightest touch was enough to draw a screeching from the raccoons and send them flying, where they lay twitching on the floor, limbs quivering and drool leaking from their mouths. Why was Xiu so less affected? The answer was obvious, as plain as her pink furless skin and red blood. They weren't the aliens here. She was. She snarled, struggling against the stick which was still held against her arm, her dirty, sweaty gray shirt doing little to insulate her. The behemoth groaned in pain, his wrist still held by her. She let go and jumped, planting her foot in his sternum, a full-force straight kick. There was a loud crack and the big alien was sent flying, Xiu thrust in the opposite direction. Both hit the walls on opposite sides of the prison room. Xiu stood back up. The behemoth did not. Total silence covered the room as every eye in the room stared incredulously at her. The remaining behemoth was surrounded by a dozen fallen raccoons, including Ima, but he didn't seem to be concerned about those who were struggling painfully to their feet. He didn't have to. Everyone was more concerned about the lone human in the room. The behemoth turned and darted, well, as much as a fat 2.5-meter brute could be said to dart, towards the still open door, abandoning his fallen comrade, and the circle of disabled prisoners scattered around him. "He's going to lock us in," she realized, and her feet were moving before she'd finished the thought. She charged ahead, each stride consuming meters at a pace. She covered the distance and thrust out her hands, catching him in the side with an instinctive xuan or double palm strike. There was another crunch and he flew sideways into the wall, but she was following, leaping and catching him in the chest with her knee. Another snapping, popping sound and he barked out the last of his breath and slid down to the floor, his barrel chest warped beyond survival. Shu looked down in shock at the alien, dead by her hands. Shu! Shu! Ima couldn't pronounce the human's name correctly. Her short muzzle just didn't want to make the proper sound, but Shu had always known when she was being addressed. She didn't respond now. The alien was staring down at her open hands, hairless but spotted with greenish blood of the locale. Ima hadn't seen the first brute die, but she'd been hypnotized along with everyone else as the second met his end, even as he tried to escape. Shu had crossed the room in an eye blink and had shoved him into the nutrient sphere dispenser, leaping high and following it up with another hit from her leg. The impact had crushed him against the dispenser, crumpling it and spilling out a stream of round nutrient spheres across the floor. Ima had been terrified and infuriated at the same time. Terrified because this alien, this human whom she'd allowed to play with the cubs for 10 days, had crushed 2 of the cruelest mercenaries available for hire as if they were nothing. Infuriated because this alien could crush these mercenaries as if they were nothing, and yet she'd cowered along with the rest of them for 10 days as Gowans were plucked from their cage for experimentation and death. Then Ima saw Shu's face and recognized the horror there. She's never killed before. She didn't know she could do this. Of course, an uncontacted species. It made Ima feel better and worse at the same time. Shu, she said again, carefully taking hold of the alien's hand, making sure her small claws were retracted before she did. Shu flinched, jerking out of her grip, and Ima forced herself to take hold again, not thinking of what those hands could do. Shu, we have to go. Shu just stared blankly. Ima reluctantly let go, turning to the others to help calm the cubs and get those who were still feeling the effects of the pain sticks to their feet. The door was still open. This was their one opportunity, and they couldn't waste it. They owed Shu, but they couldn't make her move, nor spend time convincing her. There was always the chance the door could be operated remotely. With that in mind, she hustled everyone out the door to gather themselves safely out of their cell. Ima had barely made it out herself when the door began to slide down, either commanded by remote or activated by a timer. Shoo! She made a mournful sound. The door was 3/4 closed, just above Gowan's low hips, when clawless digits grabbed hold of it from underneath. Ima heard the motors inside the walls groan as they struggled against the obstructing force. The door still moved, but barely. The whine climbed in pitch for several heartbeats until Shu ducked under and let it go. The human met Ima's gaze. She shivered as if cold. The thick coat she'd been captured with and used as a pillow while she'd slept left behind, but her eyes were clear. Good, Ima said. She turned away, sniffing at the air, using her nose to try and choose a direction. She was reasonably certain that they were on a planet, and an open window was the best she was hoping for. Picking a direction, she moved forward with the confidence she didn't really feel. This way, she said. Ima was the eldest female, so the others looked to her for leadership, but she wished it hadn't fallen upon her. She had no idea what she was doing, not that she'd admit that to the others, so she led them and hoped for the best. They got lucky in that they didn't meet any resistance within the prison wing. Soon they found themselves in amongst what was obviously a lab complex. The walls were high and white, coated in polymers that helped them resist damage, bacteria, and blood stains, Ima thought grimly. Opening the odd door revealed the labs themselves and their Corti occupants, confirming for Ima the nature of their kidnappers. One particular lab contained a Corti scientist that Yolna recognized, her remaining eye blazing with fury. She leapt at him with a snarl, and half of the other females followed to help. When they were done, the Corti would trouble no one else except the cleaning droids. Ima glanced over at Shu, who had watched the massacre with wide eyes. Shortly afterward, they encountered the first squad of guards sent to recapture them. Ima smelled them before she saw them, but when the first Myrnaherm rounded the corner, a pain stick held high in one pincher, it still took them all by surprise. The stick struck Ima across the face, and she fell with a shriek of pain, her entire body shaking with convulsions. The insectoid raised the stick to hit another, but Shu leaped in between, taking the blow across her raised upper limb. Fighting the betrayal of her own body, Ima was still able to see the crippling blow do little to the human. Shu screeched, but didn't fall, and her foot snapped out and crushed the joint of the Mjornherm's right foreleg. He tipped, emitting a high-pitched cry, and the human spun. Mjornherm weren't as big as Locale, but they still towered over the little human. It didn't matter as he collapsed and Shu's leg reached as high as her own head in a spinning kick. Mjornherm's head was torn clean from his shoulders, flying off to bounce against the far wall and putting its blood-resistant coating to the test with a spatter of beige slime. Ima watched as Shu was frozen again by shock at the worst time. The Mjornherm wasn't alone. Another came up behind, and seeing his partner killed so easily, he dropped his pain stick and went for the holster around his thorax. Before any of them could react, he pulled his pulse pistol. Shu stared uncomprehendingly as he aimed and shot her in the chest. The human reeled backwards. Ima had recovered enough to cry out, but the shocked sound was cut off in her throat as Shu recovered her balance. She didn't fall, though by rights her chest should have been a ruin of powdered bone and bruised organs. Not only could she still breathe, but she was snarling. Her teeth bared ferociously as she flung herself at her assailant. The thug was as shocked as any of them, but he aimed his pistol to try again. Shu moved more quickly than she had even in the prison room. She swept within his reach, and an open hand parrying the insectoid's extended limb. She swept it down in a circle, and her other hand snapped around the limb's joint. There was a crunch of chitin, and the limb was torn away. The pistol held the now limp pincher. Shu dropped the severed limb, and the Mjornherm didn't even have time to cry out before her open hand slammed into his thorax, sending him flying backwards. He crashed against the wall and slid to the floor, unmoving. The three other members of the five-sapient team, all Locale, surged around the corner and halted, aghast at the sight of their two dead team members. Then Shu was leaping at them, and they had no time to think. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. I am the Casual Deathworlder, your host, and this has been the Chang Saga, Chapter 1, Monkeys Reaches Stars, Part 1. I hope you enjoy this story as much as I do. This is a vital part of the Deathworlders series, and it will have a huge effect on it. As always, a ginormous shout out to my buddy and my editor, Gregor. How you doing, buddy? Thank you very much. Let us talk about those Kit Kats. At any rate, if you enjoyed this story, please go ahead and show that like button some love, and if you'd like to hear the rest of it, go ahead and hit subscribe. And be sure and hit that notification bell. Also, while I'm at it, another huge shout out to my munchkins, Kat and Charlie. I know they were waiting for this. Hello! Let's see. Question, who's got a question? I know. Crap, no, I don't know. Okay, let's see. Who here has been out to see Ghostbusters yet? No spoilers, just say whether you liked it or not in the comments down below. And I will see you next time. Everybody, y'all be safe. Take it easy. Goodbye.